The noon sun blazed mercilessly over the small frontier town of Willow Creek, its dusty streets shimmering with heat. The rail station stood at the edge of town, a long wooden platform where travelers came and went, their lives colliding briefly before scattering again. The screech of iron wheels and the hiss of steam filled the air as the westbound train slowed to a halt. Merchants, mothers, and cowhands gathered along the tracks, waiting for parcels or loved ones. But today the townsfolk's eyes were fixed on one figure, a young woman clutching a battered carpetbag with trembling hands. Her name was Clara Bennett, though no one in Willow Creek knew her yet. She had come from Missouri, answering the advertisement of a widower seeking a wife. Letters had passed between them, filled with promises of stability and companionship, and Clara, with little left behind her but silence and disappointment, had clung to the idea of a new beginning. She stepped off the train in a simple blue dress, her bonnet shading her pale face, her heart pounding with equal parts hope and dread. At the far end of the platform stood Henry Walsh, the man who had summoned her here. Broad-shouldered, respectable in his pressed vest, he looked her over with a gaze colder than she expected. Clara's lips parted into a tentative smile, but Henry did not move closer. Instead, he turned to the townsfolk who had gathered, speaking loud enough for all to hear. "I cannot marry this woman," he declared flatly. "She deceived me. She is not what she claimed." A murmur swept through the crowd. Clara froze, her bag slipping slightly from her grasp. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. Henry's mouth tightened. "The town doctor wired me last week. Rumor has it you're barren. You cannot give a man heirs, and I will not tie myself to a lie." The words struck Clara harder than any physical blow. Gasps and snickers rose from the crowd. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men shook their heads. Her throat burned as she tried to speak, but no words came. The truth was cruel. Her late mother's illness and Clara's own frail health had given rise to whispers back home that she would never bear children. Whether true or not, it had followed her like a curse, and now it had followed her here. The platform became a stage of humiliation. Children pointed. A merchant muttered, "Damaged goods." Clara's eyes blurred with tears, but she would not let them fall. She drew a breath, forcing herself to stand straighter. She had come all this way for a future, and now she stood stranded, unwanted, and utterly alone. Among the crowd, one man lingered at a distance, leaning on a post as though trying not to be seen. Elias Turner, a poor rancher with sun-creased skin and a weathered hat pulled low, had only come to town for a sack of feed. He had not intended to witness another person's shame, but something in Clara's silent endurance struck him to the core. Elias knew rejection. He knew the sting of failure. His ranch barely clung to life, cattle thin from drought, fences sagging. Worse still, his heart bore scars. His wife, Anna, had died 3 winters ago, leaving him with nothing but echoes in the quiet cabin. Since then, loneliness had become his shadow. Watching Clara stand alone on the platform, shoulders trembling though she tried to keep them firm, Elias felt that shadow stir with a painful recognition. The train whistle blew again, the engine preparing to depart. Henry Walsh turned his back, striding away without so much as a farewell. Clara remained rooted to the boards, her carpetbag at her feet, her hope collapsing around her like a house of cards. Elias could have walked away. He told himself it was none of his business. He had no money to spare, no comfort to offer, yet his boots carried him forward before his mind could argue. The townsfolk parted slightly as the tall, lean rancher approached the abandoned bride. "Miss," he said quietly, removing his hat. His voice was deep but gentle, carrying no judgment. "You got somewhere to go." Clara blinked up at him, startled. "And no," she stammered, gripping the handle of her bag tighter. "I thought I did. But—" Her gaze dropped, her throat tightening. Elias studied her for a long moment. Dust swirled between them, and the curious stares of the crowd pressed close. He could feel their whispers already. Turner's lost his wits, taking in another man's cast-off. But he also felt the weight of her despair, and it was heavier than his pride. "My ranch ain't much," he admitted, his words slow and careful. but I've got a roof, and it's dry. You don't have to stay out here for wolves to circle." Clara's eyes widened. "Why would you?" "Because nobody deserves to be left like that." His jaw tightened. "Not in front of a crowd, not anywhere." For a heartbeat, Clara hesitated, caught between fear and the fragile spark of trust. Every instinct told her to flee from more disappointment. Yet something in his rough honesty steadied her trembling heart. Slowly, she nodded. Elias picked up her carpetbag, ignoring the whispers that buzzed around them like flies. "Come on, then," he said. "Let's get you out of the sun." They walked together down the platform, leaving behind the murmurs and the sting of rejection. Clara did not know what awaited her at this man's ranch, nor did Elias know how her presence would test and change him. But as the train pulled away and the crowd dispersed, a quiet truth settled between them. Two lives broken by loss and judgment had, by fate or providence, collided at the rail station. By the time Elias helped Clara onto his old wagon, the heat of humiliation still burned in her chest. But for the first time that day, she felt a sliver of safety. He flicked the reins, and the wagon jolted forward, carrying them out of town and toward the unknown. Behind them, the rail station shrank into the horizon, but the story that had begun there was only gathering its weight. Clara sat in silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She did not dare believe in miracles. Yet beside her, Elias drove with steady patience, and something about his presence, solid, unassuming, quietly kind, planted a question in her heart she could not yet answer. Could a rejected bride and a burdened rancher, both scarred by life, find in each other what the world had denied them? The wind carried no reply, only the creak of wagon wheels and the long road ahead. The wagon rattled along the dry, rutted road leading west from Willow Creek. Dust rose in a thin cloud behind the wheels, catching the sunlight like smoke. Elias Turner kept his eyes on the reins, though his thoughts were far from the mules plodding ahead. Beside him, Clara sat quietly, hands clasped in her lap, her bonnet tilted low to shield her face from both the sun and the stares she imagined still lingered. Neither spoke for several miles. The silence was not unfriendly, but heavy, as though words might shatter the fragile truce of dignity Clara fought to maintain. Elias, for his part, understood silence. Since Anna's death, he had spoken mostly to cattle, the creak of fences, or the endless wind. He had grown used to holding his burdens inside, where they festered like thorns under skin. At last, Clara broke the quiet. Her voice was small, almost hesitant. "You didn't have to step in back there." Elias flicked the reins, squinting toward the horizon. "Didn't sit right, leaving you to fend for yourself." "But you don't know me," she said. "No," Elias admitted, his jaw tightening. "But I know what it feels like to be left behind." The words lingered between them, heavy with a weight Clara didn't dare press further. She turned her gaze to the field stretching endlessly on either side, parched earth broken by tufts of scrub and the occasional twisted mesquite. The land seemed weary, yet stubborn, much like the man who owned it. By the time the wagon creaked through a sagging gate marked Turner Ranch, the sun had dipped low, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and violet. Clara's heart tightened at the sight before her. The ranch was not much, a weather-beaten house, with a porch leaning tiredly on one side, a few outbuildings patched with mismatched boards, and fences that sagged like old men's shoulders. In the distance, a thin herd of cattle grazed on sparse grass, ribs faintly visible even from afar. "This is it," Elias said, pulling the wagon to a stop. He sounded neither proud nor ashamed, just resigned. Clara stepped down carefully, her boots sinking into the dry earth. She had imagined life in the West would be hard, but she had not pictured such desolation. Still, she reminded herself, she had no place else to go. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke and loneliness. Dust gathered in corners, and the furniture bore the wear of years, without care. On the mantel above the cold hearth rested a faded photograph in a wooden frame. Clara's eyes lingered there, a young woman with kind eyes and hair pinned neatly back, standing beside a younger Elias whose smile seemed almost unrecognizable compared to the weary lines he carried now. "Your wife?" Clara asked softly. Elias hesitated, his hand brushing the brim of his hat before he set it down. Anna. She's been gone 3 years. Clara nodded, lowering her gaze. She did not ask how Anna had died. The grief in Elias's voice told her enough. Loss had carved its mark into him as surely as drought carved the land. Over supper, a meager meal of beans and cornbread, Clara tried to make conversation. You work the ranch alone? Elias shrugged. Neighbor boy helps sometimes. But mostly yes. Used to have more hands. Back when the herd was larger. Hard to keep men when you can't pay 'em regular. Clara studied him as he spoke. His shoulders were broad but stooped, as though the weight of the land pressed against him daily. His hands, rough and scarred, spoke of endless labor. Yet his eyes, though shadowed, carried a quiet resilience. He was a man tethered to duty, even when it bled him dry. After supper, Clara insisted on washing the dishes. She needed purpose, something to keep her hands from trembling. As she scrubbed, she thought of the humiliation at the rail station, of Henry Walsh's cold rejection, and of the rumors that clung to her like burrs. Here, in this broken house, among the ghosts of another woman, she wondered what role she could possibly play. When she finished, she found Elias on the porch, staring out into the darkening fields. The air was cooler now, the first stars trembling awake in the vast sky. You don't owe me shelter, Clara said quietly, standing in the doorway. If this is too much burden. Elias cut her off with a shake of his head. A roof's no good if it can't keep more than one person dry. You're not a burden, Miss Bennett. Leastways, not compared to what I already carry. Something in his tone made Clara step closer. What do you carry? She asked before she could stop herself. Elias's jaw worked, as though weighing the cost of honesty. Debt, a herd half-starved, a house that feels emptier every winter, and a heart that ain't figured out how to stop grieving. He exhaled slowly. That's what you're walking into. Clara's chest ached at his candor. Then perhaps we're not so different, she said softly. I carry whispers that follow me, whether true or not, and the shame of being unwanted. The silence that followed was not awkward but raw, as though both had peeled back layers they rarely exposed. From somewhere in the distance came the lonely call of a coyote. Elias turned, meeting Clara's gaze fully for the first time since they'd left town. His eyes were tired, yes, but there was something else there too, an unspoken recognition. Two souls scarred differently, but scarred all the same. You can stay as long as you need, he said firmly. I won't ask for more than you're willing to give. Clara nodded, though emotion threatened to choke her. For the first time since stepping off the train, she felt the faintest stirrings of dignity returning. Perhaps she was not entirely cast off. Perhaps, in this weary rancher's house, she could prove that rejection did not define her. As the night settled thick and still around the Turner Ranch, Clara lay awake in the small room Elias had given her, staring at the cracked ceiling. She thought of Anna's photograph, of Elias's bowed shoulders, of the dry land stretching endless beyond the window. A question gnawed at her. Was she merely seeking refuge, or had Providence led her here for something deeper? In the next room, Elias sat at the table, ledger open, numbers scrawled in ink that spelled nothing but loss. His hand hovered over the page, but his thoughts strayed to the woman now under his roof. He had not sought her, had not asked for her presence. But tonight, for the first time in years, the house did not feel entirely hollow. Neither of them knew what the days ahead would bring. The burdens of ranching, of grief, of whispered rumors were heavy. Yet in the quiet of that night, both carried a sliver of something new, uncertain, fragile, but undeniably alive. The dawn broke soft and golden over Turner Ranch, spilling light across the withered fields and peeling paint of the house. Clara stood at the window of her small room, watching the horizon catch fire with color. For the first time in many weeks, she felt a reason to rise early. There was work to do, real work, not just to pass the hours, but perhaps to breathe some life into this half-forgotten place. She pulled her hair back neatly, tied on a plain apron, and stepped into the kitchen. The stove was cold, the dishes from last night stacked clean, but unpolished on the shelf. Elias had already left. She could hear the faint lowing of cattle from somewhere beyond the barn. Clara moved with quiet purpose, striking a match to coax flames into the stove. She kneaded flour and water into biscuits, stirred beans with salt and herbs she had carried in a small pouch from back east, and boiled coffee until its rich aroma filled the house. When Elias returned, sweat darkening his shirt and dust clinging to his boots, he paused in the doorway as though struck by the sight. "You didn't need to," he began. Clara interrupted gently. "A house should smell like it's lived in." Elias's lips twitched, not quite forming a smile, but close enough that Clara noticed. He washed his hands at the basin and sat, his movements heavy from labor. For a long time, neither spoke. Then, between bites, Elias muttered, "Been a while since this table felt like more than a place to set down ledgers." The words warmed Clara in ways she could not explain. She had not been welcomed as a bride, nor as a woman of standing, but here, she could make herself useful, perhaps even needed. The days fell into rhythm. Elias rose before dawn to tend to the cattle, mend fences, and scour the land for water that grew scarcer each season. Clara busied herself inside, sweeping out years of dust, mending curtains with scraps from her modest trunk, scrubbing the wooden floors until they bore a faint glow. She discovered jars of preserves long forgotten in the cellar and carefully arranged them in neat rows. Though small, these changes stitched themselves into the fabric of the ranch. The house began to feel less like a hollow shell and more like a home, and Elias, though he rarely said it aloud, noticed. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the fields in copper, Clara carried a basin of water out to the porch. Elias sat there, shoulders slumped, boots caked in mud from a day of repairing the north fence. She placed the basin at his feet. "You work hard enough," she said softly. "At least let me see to these boots." Elias blinked, startled. "I can tend to myself." Clara met his gaze. "I know you can, but you don't have to, not while I'm here." He studied her for a moment, as though weighing the sincerity in her eyes. At last, he relented, leaning back while she knelt and carefully brushed away the dirt, her hand steady. It was a simple act, but Elias felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't dared feel since Anna's passing. Gratitude, companionship, almost comfort. But whispers have a way of riding on the wind, and in a town as small as Willow Creek, every glance carried judgment. One Saturday, Elias hitched a wagon to fetch supplies. Clara asked to accompany him, eager for a change of scenery. As they walked into the general store, conversation faltered. The shopkeeper's smile was polite, but Clara could feel eyes pressing against her from every corner. A woman by the bolts of fabric leaned toward her companion, whispering not nearly low enough. "That's the Bennett girl, the one Walsh left at the rail station." Clara's cheeks burned. She lowered her gaze, focusing on the neat rows of canned goods, but the words stung like fresh nettles. Elias, standing near the counter, caught the whispers. His jaw tightened. Without a word, he set down his coins, gathered the supplies, and guided Clara back to the wagon. Only when they were halfway home did he speak, his voice gravelly. "Pay no mind to their talk." Clara's throat tightened. "It's easy for them to believe the worst. They think me less than whole, Elias. A woman who can't give children. What use is she?" Elias's grip tightened on the reins, his gaze fixed ahead. "A woman's worth ain't measured in children or gossip. You've kept this place standing these past weeks more than I ever could alone. Don't let their words shrink you." Clara looked at him, surprised by the conviction in his tone. In that moment, she saw the man beneath the weary lines, the rancher who carried his land like a cross, but who still believed in fairness, in dignity. Hope flickered, faint but alive. That night, Clara sat by lamplight, mending one of Elias's shirts. The fire crackled low in the hearth. Elias entered, pausing when he saw her bent over the cloth. "You don't need to wear yourself out with all that," he said. Clara looked up, needle poised. "I'm not weary. For the first time in years, I feel useful." Elias swallowed, words forming and then dying on his lips. Finally, he managed. "You've done more than patch shirts and sweep floors. You've given this place a sound it's been missing." "What sound?" she asked. "Life," Elias said simply. Clara's hand trembled slightly around the needle. She bent back to her stitching, but her heart beat quicker, louder, as though it wanted to be heard. The weeks ahead were not easy. A calf fell ill. Elias spent 2 nights nursing it, only for it to die by morning. Fences sagged again after a storm. Money grew tighter. Yet through each trial, Clara stood steady, offering quiet encouragement, sharing labor where she could, and reminding Elias that even small victories mattered. One evening, after a long day, they stood together at the edge of the field, watching the stars bloom overhead. The silence stretched, not heavy this time, but gentle. "You ever think," Clara murmured, "that maybe we were meant to meet the way we did? Not as others planned, but as Providence arranged." Elias's eyes lingered on her profile, the way the starlight traced her features. "I've thought it," he admitted, "though I'm still not sure what it means." Clara turned, meeting his gaze. For a heartbeat, neither looked away. It was not love yet, not the kind that swept like wildfire, but it was something truer, the beginning of trust, the faintest whisper of hope, fragile but undeniable. That night, as Clara blew out the lamp and lay in bed, she realized something had shifted. She was no longer the abandoned bride, defined by rejection. Here, on this burdened ranch, she was shaping something new, not just for Elias, but for herself. And though tomorrow's hardships waited, she carried into her dreams the sound of Elias's voice, low and certain, naming her presence not as a burden, but as life itself. The winter winds swept hard across the Turner Ranch, carrying with them a sharpness that rattled windows and bent the brittle fence posts. Elias moved through the cold mornings with his usual determination, though Clara noticed how each day seemed to draw deeper lines into his face. Hardship was not new to him, but the ranch's struggles weighed heavier than ever. The drought had lingered longer than expected. Grass shriveled, and the cattle grew thin. Neighbors whispered that Elias should sell off what remained, cut his losses, and abandon the land that had swallowed so much of his strength. But Elias would not bend, not when this soil was all that tied him to his father's memory, to the life he had fought so fiercely to preserve. Clara saw his resolve and admired it, yet she feared the toll it would take. She too had known the ache of being cast aside, but this was different. Elias's pride was his only shield, and it was wearing thin. One frigid evening, she found him sitting by the hearth, head bowed, ledger open before him. The numbers stared bleakly back, debts outweighing hopes. He had not noticed her enter until she laid a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Elias," she said softly, "you don't have to bear this alone." His eyes flicked up to hers, weary yet steady. "It's my land, Clara, my burden, been mine since the day my father put the first plow in my hands." "And yet," Clara replied, her voice firm, "since the day you took me in, it's been ours." The words hung between them, fragile yet undeniable. For the first time, Elias did not argue. He closed the ledger, leaned back in his chair, and allowed the silence to speak for him. The following week brought an unexpected storm. Rain lashed the fields, soaking the dry earth and filling the long empty creek bed. Elias stood in the doorway, watching as thunder cracked across the heavens, and a smile, rare and unguarded, spread across his face. "Land's drinking again," he whispered, as though in prayer. Clara stood beside him, her hand brushing against his. Neither pulled away. For hours, they watched the storm together, hope returning with every drop of rain that kissed the soil. When the storm passed, green shoots began to rise timidly from the ground. It was not salvation yet, but it was promise. Elias threw himself into work with renewed vigor, and Clara, too, found purpose in tending the ranch alongside him. They became partners in the truest sense, not bound by vows spoken in haste, but by a shared will to endure. But the town of Willow Creek was not so quick to forget. When Clara accompanied Elias to the church social, the air filled with sidelong glances and whispers sharp as thorns. Some called her barren. Others questioned Elias's judgment for sheltering a woman no man else would claim. Clara felt each word pierce her, but she held her chin high. It was Elias who silenced the crowd, without raising his voice. "She's the reason Turner Ranch still stands," he said calmly, his hand resting on Clara's arm. "Judge her if you like, but know this, while you whispered, she worked. While you sneered, she mended. And while you doubted, she gave me something none of you could. Hope. A hush fell over the hall. Some shifted uncomfortably, others looked away. Clara's throat tightened with emotion, but she said nothing. For the first time since her rejection at the rail station, she felt truly seen, not as a cast-off, but as a woman worth standing beside. The seasons turned. Spring arrived with new calves and fields softened by rain. Clara's touch was everywhere. Curtains embroidered with care, meals rich with warmth, a garden sprouting vegetables near the porch. The ranch pulsed with life again, but the greatest change lay not in the land, but in the hearts of those who lived upon it. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in hues of violet and gold, Elias led Clara out to the pasture. The cattle grazed peacefully, and the air smelled of wildflowers carried by the breeze. I never expected, Elias began slowly, that the woman I took in out of pity would become the one I can't imagine this place without. Clara's breath caught. She turned to him, eyes shining in the fading light. And I never expected the man who saved me from despair would be the one to give me back my worth. Elias reached for her hand. His palm was rough, scarred from years of toil, but his grip was steady, certain. Clara, he said, voice low, I've lost much in this life, but with you it feels less like loss and more like beginning again. She swallowed hard, her heart trembling with a joy too fierce to name. For all the trials, all the whispers, all the doubts, they had found something greater than circumstance, something chosen against all odds. The night deepened. They sat together on the porch, the stars spilling bright across the heavens. Silence stretched between them, but it was not the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of belonging. Clara leaned her head against Elias's shoulder. He wrapped his arm gently around her, drawing her close. For once, the burden he carried did not feel unbearable. For once, Clara's past rejection no longer haunted her. Together, they had carved something neither had dared to hope for. A life rebuilt not from perfect beginnings, but from resilience, trust, and love born of struggle. The ranch would still see hard days. The cattle might falter again. The town might whisper still. But Elias and Clara had learned the one truth that would sustain them through every storm, that love, when chosen freely, could root deeper than hardship, outlast drought and judgment, and flourish even on the hardest soil. And as the night wind swept softly over Turner Ranch, carrying with it the scent of earth newly awakened, Elias and Clara sat side by side, no longer a burdened rancher and a rejected bride, but partners bound by a love that had defied every odd set against them.